But let's first talk about picking the right recipe for your bean, because I think that's something everyone has to worry about. For the longest time with the decent espresso machine, I only thought about making what I would call the lever shot, which is a shot that rises in pressure and takes about 30 seconds to run. And it looks like the espressos that you're used to in cafes. It comes historically from machines with levers that would do this. And I think the geniuses who built those first espresso machines tinkered a lot with the tubing and the hardware to come up with something that made good coffee with the bean style that they had in Italy. So when you're making espresso, what you're doing is you're extracting material from beans. And the main measure of how easy the coffee comes out of the beans is a term called solubility. Solubility is the ability for water to take materials out. And the more you roast a bean, the more you take those carbohydrates and the cellulose, and the more you take the cellulose and the more you break it up, the more you expose the stuff, the flavor stuff that's on the cellulose to water. Okay? And it's very much like if you took a steak and you put it in water, nothing comes really into the water. You burn the hell out of that steak, you put it in water, suddenly it gets quite dark, right? The more you roast something, the more it becomes easily liberated into water. And traditional bean from Italy has been one that's been what I would call medium to dark, and it's one that liberates fairly easily to water. It's the reason that you can have in Italy espressos that use only 7 grams of coffee to 14 grams. Those are the traditional doses there, because the beans are usually quite roasted, and so they give up their water, they give up the flavor quite easily, and that results in cost savings on the machine, cost savings on the staff, because they can make the coffees faster, less money for the coffee as well, and it's kept the price down to about €1 in Italy for those coffees. Those are medium roast coffees, and you generally a 30-second shot seems to work best for them. That's the engineering. Now, if you get beans that are less roasted means lighter in color, then they're going to be less soluble. They're going to give up the material less easily to water. So if you take a bean that's quite light, I have a handy color chart here. Well, imagine a lighter bean instead of a darker bean. That same 30-second recipe is not going to extract the same amount of coffee material from that bean. There's one other thing that complicates things too, which is when an espresso is running and water is pushing through that coffee material is coming out, and over 30 seconds, about 20% of this material in the coffee puck goes away. So as your water is going through that puck and time is elapsing, this puck is getting thinner and thinner and is resisting water less, which is why we see faster and faster espresso flow as the espresso proceeds. For reasons that aren't really well understood, lighter roast beans seem to fall apart easier. And we don't know why, but the lighter the roast, and also certain kinds of beans are more likely to fall apart than others. So what this has meant practically is for those darker Italian styles, that they had to worry less about their grinders, less worry about puck prep, less worry about high flow rates, because the pucks resist water better over time. The style, though, of lighter roasts presents then 2 problems. One is, how do we get more water time, water contact? How do we fight that solubility with that lighter roast? And then secondly, how do we keep the puck from disintegrating? Because if it disintegrates, the water just starts gushing and you've got lemonade, which is no fun. So the theory I came up with, which was to try and look at the matrix of possible recipes. And down here, we've got this idea of the lever shot, which is 30 seconds and varies from a flat 9-bar shot, which is absolutely what you see in most cafes now, to a more historically accurate lever shot, which gently rose pressure and then decreased it. So the idea behind the lever shot versus the 9-bar shot, remember I just said that pucks are going to lose material over time. Well, that happens with medium to dark roast as well. And if you keep the pressure constant, then the speed of the water is going to accelerate really fast, especially in that last 5-10 seconds. And the flavor is not going to be great. This is, by the way, why people make ristrettos. So if you have an espresso that's falling apart at about 20 seconds, you might just stop it at 20 seconds and you'll have a less wide flavor compass, but you won't have a lot of unpleasant sourness. Okay, so the lever profile, instead of holding 9 bar constant, instead decreases pressure. And it tries to decrease the pressure at the same rate that this puck is losing material. And the goal of that is to honor the fact that the puck is not resisting water pressure as well. So you give it less water pressure. So that all makes good sense. And this is the why lever shots taste better, especially with medium to dark roasts. Now let's move over to 2 other styles of beans, light and what I'll call ultralight. Now, in order to categorize light, ultralight, and medium, and let's say dark beans, I use some words describing the flavor instead of looking at the color and not really trusting what the roaster says. So what I call a light bean is one that has what I call an ultralight bean is one that has absolutely no flavors generated through the roasting process that taste of roasting, say caramelization or Maillard reactions. That's what I call an ultralight. Going to the medium stage, a medium is dominated by roasting flavors, generally chocolate. You might have caramels, you might have toffee, but that's what a medium looks like. And what I would call a either medium light or a light bean is somewhere in between, where you're going to have roasted flavors. And typically, like someone might describe a light bean as having pear caramel flavors, for example. And that the key word to hook onto is caramel. So that caramel flavor is likely created by roasting, just like roasting anything in the oven would do. Some people have objected. Yes, you can get chocolate and caramel flavors innate in beans, but that's not what I'm talking about here. And then as you go darker, and you start roasting more, you'll get darker chocolate, darker roasting, until you eventually end up in ultra dark or dark roasts, oils coming out, and then you start having burn flavors. You don't generally have layers of milky, lighter chocolate anymore. You've got something very, very strong. And that would be more like a traditional espresso, especially something you find in France, for example. That style is still preferred there. So that's how I'm talking about those beans. And notice that I'm talking about the level of roasting causing flavors to change, which is then also changing the solubility and the ability of the puck to resist pressure. So picking the right recipe is all about finding the recipe that will address the solubility and that puck resistance. If you've got a bean that's medium to dark, in other words, you make an espresso and it's dominated by chocolate flavors, there's a good chance that the lever profile and things that look like it, like Londinium, are going to be the best for that. If you use a profile that's meant for a light roast on a medium, it's going to generally what I call either over extracted or just come out with lots of defective flavor notes, because as you roast more and more, there are bad flavors in there too. Let's say really roasty burn flavors. And if you leave the beans with too much water contact time, some of those unpleasant flavors are going to come out. So always with espresso, it's all about getting the good flavors and not having the bad flavors. Do a 60-second shot with a dark bean and it's going to taste like a forest fire. It's not going to be fun. All right, so let's say we're now moving down to the ultralights, which are the least soluble, and they also don't have caramelization flavors, and they are also tending to fall apart. The best recipe I've found for that is what I call the Allonge, or other, Scott Rayo came up with the name 20 years ago. And what that is one where we're putting a lot of water flow through the puck. It's the highest water flow. It's typically 4 to 4.5 mils per second. and you're going for a very high ratio of water to beans, more in the 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, instead of espresso with a medium roast, which is more typically in the 2-to-3-to-1 ratio, right? 2 parts water for 1 part coffee bean. Now, the reason the Allonge works with those ultralights is because you're crashing water so quickly through it, and the puck is eroding, that it is able to cope with the puck falling apart and still get water out. If you're watching your decent espresso machine and you see the pressure is actually at 9 bar, what you don't want to do with an Allonge is make a gusher. So lots of people with traditional machines will make a fast shot, and it's done in 15, 20 seconds. But if they had a pressure gauge, they would see that all that's happening is that they're just gushing water through the beans, and the poor solubility of those beans means that only unpleasant flavors are coming out. So in order for the Allonge to work, we need 2 things to happen. We need the fast flow rate to adjust the solubility, but we also need a pressure that is in the espresso ranges, which is typically 6 to 10 bar. So if you've got a bean that really has no caramelization flavors, or the caramelization flavors are innate to that bean, then I would highly recommend you try the Allonge. So making the Allonge means you grind fairly coarsely, not that fine, and you're aiming for about a 30-35 second shot. But what you want to do is get your grind so that your pressure is ending up in the 8 or 9 bar range at peak. So you are actually making an espresso, if you think of an espresso as being a certain pressure and a certain amount in cup. However, you're putting a lot more water through those beans, which is addressing the low solubility of those. Going up a little bit into slightly more roasted, you've got this intermediate world, which is where most of us live in specialty coffee. So either light to medium light. Medium light would be, you still have chocolate flavors, but you are bringing out other flavors. Red wine, tropical fruit, flowery flavors are also coming out quite strongly. Yesterday I had one that had strong strawberry notes mixed in with the chocolate. And you don't want to mute those. It's quite possible to make that really nice bean only taste like chocolate and not bring out those other things. And the art of making good espresso is expressing, that bean as much as you can to have as wide a compass of flavor as possible. So in general, then, those beans are going to have, they're going to extract well at the beginning, medium light to light beans, but you're always going to have an issue with the puck falling apart. So things you can do to avoid that. One is you can buy a good grinder. The worse the grinder, the more likely those light to medium light beans are going to fall apart and channel. So generally the point of departure for decent espresso users is the niche grinder. It's the cheapest grinder that we find acceptable. And then you can go up all the way to lots of fancy, beautiful stuff, all the way up to Cafetech, which is considered the best grinder. But all the grinders in that sphere should give you very acceptable espresso. If you are using, let's say, a SETI grinder, anything from Baratza, you're probably not going to have very good light to medium light beans. Those are inexpensive grinders, great value, but I would probably save them for more coarse grinds. Actually, the Allonge style would probably work quite well with Baratza grinders since they do coarse fairly well. So you've got your medium light to ultra light bean, and it's not tasting very good. So you're wondering, what should I do? So a couple of things you should look at. One is it just tasting quite acidic? And if so, there's typically 2 reasons for that. One is the puck is falling apart, okay? And then the second is you're just not addressing the solubility. So you're not opening up the flavors. The thing to try, I would go, if you have a lever shot, I would go directly to Allonge, because you want to see just how open you can get it and just how big this bean should be. So Don't do blooming yet. Do the allonge, because you take a light bean and you do the allonge style with it, and suddenly you're tasting blueberries and flowers and all this crazy stuff. And you go, oh, okay, this bean actually has a lot going for it. Or you don't, and you do the allonge and you go, it's still quite subtle. It actually is not a huge, what Scott Rayo calls fruit bomb, in which case this middle recipe, which is the blooming recipe, would probably be a good choice. Now, blooming is a kind of compromise between allonge and lever. What it is a normal espresso, so pre-infusion, rise 9 bar, decreased pressure, except that if you did that with a light to medium light bean, the solubility means that you wouldn't extract that much from the bean. So what the blooming espresso does is put water in and then pause for 30 seconds while the beans then start to give up their material to the water, and then it makes an espresso. So blooming is actually not that weird an espresso shot. And for that reason, it's kind of my go-to for anything actually that's medium light, anything that's got subtlety to it, anything that doesn't have strong off flavors. I love blooming. The typical total runtime for me with blooming is 72 seconds. So it's not great for cafes because it takes twice as long as a normal espresso. But once you dial it in and you nail it, it's great because you still have crema, you still have a ratio, typically 3 to 1, 2.5 to 3 to 1 on the beans. So in other words, 15 grams in will give you between 30 to 45 in the cup. So the thickness of the shot, the TDS, the concentration, still looks like an espresso, whereas an allonge is looking more like a pour over. Right? It's much more dilute. So those are the 3 recipes that I have. Let's go. I haven't talked yet about darker than medium, and then I'll open it up to questions. So darker than medium generally is going to have off flavors. You're going to have burn flavors and just unpleasant tannins. And really what you're going for is like a nice concentrated, thick chocolate, dark chocolate whack in the face, right? That's the style. It also milks quite nicely. And so you are likely to look at shorter ratios, okay? More in the 2 to 1 or 1.8 to 1. It's not unusual for me to do a 15 in and like 26, 28 out if I'm faced with something that has some oils coming out. Now, you're also going to try and hide flaws in that bean. And I generally find that going too fine, too slow will get you a more chocolatey espresso that hides defects. Now, that's also the case if you take a really nice bean. So I have a really good medium bean, a medium roast bean that has some raspberry notes in it, and I grind it super, super fine. I make a 45-second lever shot with it, and I just have a chocolate bomb. There's no subtlety outside of chocolate, but I do have layers of chocolate. So I've got some milky chocolate medium, maybe a little bit of dark, but I don't have any burn notes. When I've got a bean that's not very expensive, let's say someone gives me a bag of something roasted in Italy, I know it's not going to have great subtlety. I know it's going to have off notes. I also know it's not super fresh. So what am I going to do with that? I'm probably going to do a 40, 45-second shot, ground too finely with a lever profile. The reason I'm using the lever profile and not the flat 9 bar is because I don't want a lot of acidity on the end. Generally, I have found the Londinium profile is not good at hiding taste defects. And I think that that's because it has a more effective pre-infusion, where the lever profile doesn't have as effective a pre-infusion. So Londinium is my go-to profile for a medium bean that is good, that has really nice subtleties, because it's somewhere going towards blooming, right? It's a pressurized pre-infusion with a no quantity of water, but it's still doing a nice thick shot. It still looks like a lever shot. So if you're getting weird off flavors in your medium to dark, I would recommend finer grind and also shorter shots. Hold them start pulling something that looks more like a 1 to 5 to 1 or 2 to 1 shot. One last thing I'll say is that if you're new to the decent espresso machine, probably your puck prep is going to be bad. And that's just what it is, because you haven't had access to a machine that gives you feedback showing you your puck prep is bad. And so you should initially strive for shorter ratios of water to coffee. So don't try and do 15 in, 42 out. You don't have the skills yet. You will, after some time, be able to pull that shot and it will taste great. But instead, go for 30, 32 grams out from 15 in, and get that espresso to taste good. As your grinder gets better, as your puck prep skills get better, you can extend that time, either by extend that ratio, either by having the shot run a little bit, or generally what people do is grind a little bit coarser. So your 15 in now becomes a 32 out, a 36, a 42 out. And by the way, that ratio of 42 is typically what I'm doing with 15 in, 42 out with something that's light or medium light. Whereas 15 in, 36 out is what I'm doing with something that's more chocolate plus medium light.